You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 11th of July 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, France's football team lost this week, but there is still everything to play for in the formation of the new government. We'll look at the challenges facing the Fifth Republic. Then the Nato summit convenes for a final day in Washington.
This is really the time where we are tested. If we want to stand up for democracy and freedom, it's now, and the place is Ukraine.
The outgoing Secretary-General of NATO there, Jens Stoltenberg, will ask about NATO's pledge to Ukraine and what else is on the agenda. We'll have a rustle through the front pages and a hit of business news from Perth, and we'll be in Seoul to follow the impact of an indefinite strike announcement by the workers' union at Samsung, the world's largest maker of chips, smartphones and televisions. Plus,
the AI does it much faster, of course, so we have learned several hundreds of artists, whereas an expert would spend his whole career essentially on learning one or two artists.
We'll examine how artificial intelligence may be prompting a revolution in the art world. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. US President Joe Biden faced fresh doubts yesterday about his re-election chances from the former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the film star George Clooney, who may influence other Democratic lawmakers and financial donors. The Taiwan Defense Ministry said today it's closely watching Chinese military movements after a surge in warplanes joined drills with China's Shandong aircraft carrier in the Pacific. And Rwandan President Paul Kagame is expected to cruise to a fourth term in office in an election on Monday against the only two opposition candidates who were cleared to run against him. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, following the second round of the snap elections, France may now face a long period of political paralysis. Can a functional coalition be built, given that none of the three blocs elected have an outright majority? Far from Macron's aim of clarifying the political situation, it's become much more complex. The new Popular Front, the NFP, a left-wing coalition, came first. Macron's Ensemble coalition came second and lost 72 seats. And National Rally, that's the RN, the far right, came third. Well, I'm joined now by Philippe Mallière, who's Professor of French and European Politics at University College London and a Monocle Radio regular contributor. Philippe, are you over the shock yet?
Well, good morning, Georgina. Yes, as you put it, the situation remains very unclear indeed, and Macron wished to clarify the situation. I think he got the opposite. And we are clearly in a political conundrum. Three blocks of almost the same, on the same level. Of course, the left is ahead, followed by Macron's bloc and then National Rally. So the discussions, negotiations even have started in France since Sunday to try to concoct a majority. But whatever scenario you can imagine, and that includes a rainbow coalition, i.e. coalition comprising some elements from the left, moderates, Macron's party, together with some Republicans from the main Conservative Party, all that together fails also to get an absolute majority. So very complex situation. And Macron yesterday finally broke his silence because we hadn't heard from him since Sunday. He's currently in Washington on a state visit, and he wrote a letter to the French people. And that's very interesting because there were three main points in that letter. The first one was that, yes, we defeated the far right. That's what he wrote, of course, with a reference to the so-called Republican Front, where all parties, so to speak, ganged up against national right to defeat it. Secondly, no one won the election. And thirdly, he kind of suggested that there should be some kind of broad coalition. So, of course, that infuriated the left, because the left argues that it has come out on top, it has won the election, therefore Macron should invite the left to form a government. So this is where we are this morning, confused, no majority inside, and this letter, instead of appeasing the nation, probably has sort of had the opposite effect.
I mean, the NFP is made up of several parties hastily thrown together. Is it cohesive enough to lead a minority government?
Well, so far it has been cohesive enough, because I think the whole purpose of that left-wing coalition is to save seats, and I think they were quite successful at that. But of course, as you say, it's a broad coalition. You know, it's sort of spanning from the sort of left populist with Mélenchon's party to moderates, social democrats, Greens, etc. It remains to be seen whether they can stay together. And I think for the time being, particularly if the prospect of forming a government, left-wing government, should probably be enough for them to stay together for the time being. But of course, if that doesn't work out and they can't in the end form a government, then there will be other options. And then the center, the political center, Macron's center, will try to appeal to some moderate elements on the left. And at this stage, probably that coalition could implode. And but we're not there yet. And I think for the time being, if you listen carefully, all leaders of the left, moderates and more radical, they are staying together.
And who would they like to be the prime minister?
That's another issue which hasn't been sorted yet. A big one. The left doesn't have a candidate. It doesn't have a candidate for one major reason. It didn't expect to win. So they didn't bother to sort of agree on a name in run up to the election, because they thought it'd be a divisive thing to start agreeing on a name. It's difficult. Mélenchon's party has been saying all along that it should be one of them, given that they have the larger parliamentary group. And to add even more complexity to an already very complex situation, it is turning out that the socialist parliamentary group is now neck and neck with Mélenchon's party, with about the same number of MPs. So who knows? It seems to me that it would be someone who can be consensual enough, who can sort of unite the left and can work with Macron. And I think if you sort of list all those factors, I think that would seem to exclude someone like Mélenchon or someone from his party.
But we could be looking at the leader of the Greens, possibly.
Absolutely. Marine Tondelier, another Marine, who is the leader of the Green, has had a very impactful, very energetic campaign. And she probably now she's a kind of a serious contender for the post. But there are other people, there are people who are also in a socialist party. It won't be former President François Hollande, who was re-elected in his old seat in Corrèze, for the opposite reason of Mélenchon. It's been around for so long. He also divides on the left. The radical left doesn't like him. So very hard. I would sort of bet on someone younger, probably a female politician.
Now, is this idea of a technocratic government being formed still floating around? And could that be the solution, at least until another election can be called, which can constitutionally happen in a year's time? And I wonder, if that did happen, would it increase the likelihood of a vote of no confidence, particularly when it comes to passing a budget?
I think a proper technician government, as we know them in Belgium, Italy, I think would seem to be not to be on the cards right now. I think that it's not part of French political culture. If you listen to the main political actors in France, they absolutely want to form a party with a sort of well-known politicians. And that's not absolutely the first scenario at the moment. I think we could get to that situation if really the situation is really the conundrum goes on for a while, and I'm talking here weeks, if not months, then probably we would have to go down that road. But that's not part of French political culture again. I think that if the left can't form a government, I think we would probably, the main political actors will spend time trying to form a rainbow coalition. And that rainbow coalition could be quite broad, of course, excluding the far right, that is for sure. It remains to be seen who on the left would agree to join that coalition. Anyone joining that coalition, of course, would very much risk undermining the new Popular Front. So it's very unclear, but if you do the math, figures don't add up. Any scenario at the moment falls quite short of an absolute majority. So no clarification in sight, it seems to me.
You talk about weeks, if not months, and I just want to focus on timing briefly. The Olympics are coming up. So is August, when most of Paris, including the government, whatever its makeup, disappears from the city. When will this be settled, and what are the implications for France in limbo?
I think that the timing is terrible, as you say, with such a major event, the Olympics. France ought to have a government, in order and well and running. There's still a few weeks to go, not many for that, and well, in the meantime, the incumbent prime minister is staying put. He wanted to resign on Monday, but Macron refused his resignation for very clear and obvious reason. He doesn't know, no one knows when the next government will be appointed. So in the meantime, one needs a government. Gabriel Attal, the incumbent prime minister, stays put together with the government. But I think probably in the next, I can't really say when the next government will be appointed, but I think it's certainly a matter of days, maybe weeks. It would be very bad indeed if comes the Olympics that there's still no government.
Philippe, thank you very much indeed. That's Philippe Mallière there. And this is The Globalist. It is 2:12 in Washington, 7:12 here in London. The 32 members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, NATO, have been gathering this week as the military alliance marks 75 years since its formation, amid security threats arising from the Russian invasion of Ukraine and China's growing assertiveness in the Asia-Pacific. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Dr. Marion Messmer, who's a senior research fellow in international security at Chatham House. Marion, many thanks for coming in so bright and early. Yesterday, the agenda turned to how the alliance plans to ramp up defence capabilities. What is the plan?
There's actually quite a lot that's been announced so far out of the summit. Not all unexpected, because the NATO defence ministers meeting about a month ago has really paved the way for this. First and foremost, it's the sort of much brighter picture on defence spending per GDP across the alliance, which is now almost universally at or above 2%. There were also, discussions of longer-term support for Ukraine, where allies have agreed to spend at least 40 billion euros over the course of this year. And this is intended to be a longer-term and sustainable funding so that Ukraine doesn't have to focus so much on fundraising for its war efforts and can instead focus on what is actually happening both on the front and domestically. And then third of all, a really big piece of that was also better coordination with defence industry, because industry partners over the last 2 years have had a few different complaints about how various governments have been handling these contracts. And so there were some symbolic contracts that were being signed during the summit, but they also announced longer term plans to coordinate better with industry.
Just focusing in on Ukraine, were there specific pledges? Because we earlier in the programme heard Jens Stoltenberg saying it's here and now and it's Ukraine. This would appear to be one of the key issues for NATO.
Absolutely. So in addition to the funding, the additional funding that was pledged, there is also additional training and assistance work that's going to be going on. This is going to be organized by NATO with Ukrainian officers traveling to NATO for training missions. It's part of a longer term coordination with the alliance to make sure that once it's possible, once the fighting has stopped in some way, Ukraine is absolutely ready to become a NATO member. And the other thing that really surprised me in that regard a little, because a few months ago the language wasn't quite so clear, but the language has now been really clear on Ukraine definitely joining NATO. Not at the moment because of the ongoing conflict, but eventually once the fighting has ceased and once it's possible for Ukraine to become a member.
Did NATO also talk about how to make itself war ready in the face of Chinese aggression?
So I thought it was really interesting how China has been handled in this. So there was a really strong pushing back against the Chinese cooperation with Russia, and China was very much warned that this is something that NATO doesn't appreciate, and it sort of appealed to China as a member of the Security Council and being bound by the UN Charter as needing to also therefore take its responsibility seriously in that regard. And we of course know that for the US, China is becoming a more and more important potential competitor. And what I think we might see in that regard from the European side of the alliance is a much stronger focus on Ukraine and the threat from Russia, so that the US is freed up a little more to focus on China.
The orange elephant in the room, was that addressed, the possibility of a Trump presidency and what that might mean for the alliance?
I think this has overshadowed much of the summit. It wasn't necessarily addressed in the room as such, where the focus was very much on celebrating the alliance at 75, welcoming Sweden and Finland, and of course focusing on all the actually quite significant transformations that NATO has been able to undergo in the last 2 years. But we also know that on the sidelines of the summit, delegations, of course, met with Biden and with the White House one-to-one, but many, many delegations also met with Trump's advisors, sort of preparing for a potential different outcome of the election. And is something European allies have been worried about increasingly over the last year, because despite all of the talk that Europe needed to be ready to stand on its own, there are a lot of governments across Europe that have essentially hoped that Biden would be re-elected, that there wouldn't be another Trump term. So I think European governments are not quite as ready to stand on their own when it comes to defence as maybe they should have been, given that we saw what a Trump presidency can do.
I mean, there's been a lot of comment on Biden's age. I wonder if NATO, too, at 75 is getting a little too old. Does the alliance need a fresh look?
It's a good question. I think for institutions, it's perhaps a little different than for people, because NATO, especially now, especially after the sort of focusing that happened throughout the initial days and month of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is much stronger, much more cohesive now than it was perhaps for many years. So perhaps more than a new look, NATO really needed that focus on an external threat, which is of course also a double-edged sword, because that can't be the driving force for a long time. But while it has to be the driving force, while there is a war ongoing in Europe, I think the alliance is actually much more focused than we've seen it. I really hope that some of these longer term plans, like the defense plans that are being made and so on, can be transformed into something where NATO doesn't have to be on permanent alert, because that's obviously not a state we want to be in. I would very much like for the war in Ukraine to end and for there to be peace in Europe again. But I think at the same time, even in that situation, NATO would still be really relevant and really important. So the question is, how can the alliance maintain the focus that it has had without constantly being on alert?
So Washington is yet to wake up today, but what's on the final day's agenda?
Well, I think today we can see some continuation out of the points that came out of yesterday. So we saw some discussions around training and assistance for Ukraine. So I think, the alliance will today begin to look at the next year. What we've seen over the last few summits is that they are always followed up with an announcement of the next summit. We already heard the alliance will be meeting in Turkey, and then another summit in the Netherlands in a year's time. So I think we can see some preparatory work for that and some agenda setting for these meetings.
I mean, there is a sense that the world is in a pre-war era. Is that your impression? And is NATO doing enough to ensure that it doesn't happen, or that if it does, the Western alliance is victorious?
It's a really good question. I think we are not just in a pre-war era. We are sort of in a on again, off again war era, if that makes sense, right? Like we've seen so much aggression over the last 2 years, not just in Ukraine. I mean, there was also the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. There are lots of tensions that could flare up at any moment. NATO as an alliance is not as much in the business of conflict prevention as some of the member states' governments independently. I know that many of them are monitoring various conflicts. They're trying to make sure that they wouldn't erupt, but NATO's business really is making sure that Europe is safe and defended when it comes to it. I think we're now in a much better position than we were 2 years ago, and I think we're going in the right direction in that regard.
Marion, thank you so much. That's Marion Messmer there. Now, still to come on the programme.
We do see our military forces in all NATO member countries being called up more frequently to respond to wildfires and floods and hurricanes. So already our military is being increasingly tasked with climate action.
We'll hear from a climate and defence specialist and the Vice Chair of the US Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board. This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Let's continue now today with the newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Charles Hecker. He has been a senior partner at Control Risks. He's a Monocle Radio regular. He has a new book coming out very, very soon about Russia.
That's right. It's all being grammar and punctuation corrected as we speak.
Charles, is it going to make you a millionaire?
Unlikely, but hope dies last.
Well, if it does make you a millionaire, according to a new report, you may just want to leave Britain.
Well, that's right. So we're going to look at a headline in the FT today, a really interesting piece on money and demographics. And the headline says, UK to lose the most millionaires by 2028, says UBS. And so the FT is quoting a report from the Swiss bank UBS that the UK and the Netherlands are going to experience a mass emigration of millionaires. Now, don't lose too much hope yet, Georgina. The UK still has the world's third largest population of millionaires, but that population is going to shrink 17%. We're going to go down from 3.062 million millionaires in last year to 2.542 million millionaires by 2028. You might rush to judgment and think that this is due to a change in legislation governing the presence of non-DOMs in the UK, where residents here are not taxed on their worldwide income. But UBS is pointing towards different trends, and that is that millionaires these days are incredibly mobile and much more flexible in their location, and people will be moving from the UK to be closer to places where they make things and build things and buy things and sell things rather than sitting strictly in a financial capital. A couple of places that will gain millionaires are the UAE, perhaps not so surprising, and Singapore as well. Millionaires, it seems, Georgina, are just that much more mobile these days and can move around a lot more easily.
Taiwan, it looks, is projected to experience the largest growth in millionaires.
Well, that's right. Among the big gainers, the number one is Taiwan, which is going to see almost 50% more millionaires in its population by 2028. This is tied in part to the explosion of semiconductor manufacturing in Taiwan and the wealth that that industry both creates and attracts. Other big winners are Israel, India. Interestingly, Russia will have more millionaires. One of the reasons why the number of millionaires in the UK is dropping is that a lot of sanctioned Russian individuals are leaving the country. So that pulls money out of the country. The US, France, Saudi Arabia, Germany, mainland China all top the list of big winners.
Now, if you're at the other end of the scale and looking for somewhere cheap to live...
Yeah, you and I are staying put for the time being, right?
But also, apparently, from the Japan Times, we are better off in Tokyo than in San Juan.
Well, that's right. No offense to the capital of Puerto Rico, but we're going to the Japan Times right now, which is telling us, according to a study by Mercer, that Tokyo is now one of the least expensive places to live in the world, and it is, in fact, less expensive than the capital of Puerto Rico. And so this is a huge shift in Tokyo's status in the world. Tokyo has consistently, over the years, in this very study by Mercer, been one of the most expensive places to live in the world. This is in part due to a plummeting of the Japanese yen, making Japan a much more thrifty place to live. Tokyo has fallen a full 30 places from its peak in 2023. In 2020, it was the number 3 most expensive place in the world. In 2012, it was the global most expensive place to live. As far as the rest of the list, Hong Kong is number 1. Singapore is number 2. New York is the 7th most expensive place to live in the world, and London, perhaps not surprisingly, in the top 10 at number 8.
Just outside of Asia, looking at European cities, Zurich, the 3rd most expensive city, Geneva, Basel, and Bern, all up there.
That's right. Switzerland is dominating some of the most expensive places to live in the world. All of the country's biggest cities are way, way up there. And that is in keeping with Mercer's findings over the years. The interesting thing is that Swiss cities happen to dovetail with a couple of other big surveys, because in addition to the most expensive survey that Mercer publishes, there are various, including The Economist. They publish the most livable cities in the world. Monocle also publishes its own index of the world's most livable cities. And Swiss cities might be pricey, but everyone's telling us that they're worth it because they're always ranked as extremely livable as well.
Absolutely. Now, it's one thing finding a great place to live, but you've also got to have a great thing to read with you.
That's right. I'm very, very happy to turn to the New York Times and talk a little bit about the book world in front of book editor Georgina Godwin. The New York Times is in anticipation of next year being 2025, and so a quarter of the 21st century sort of behind us. The New York Times is compiling a list of the 100 best books of the 21st century. And this is a list that's compiled in a data science fashion, voted on by 503 different novelists, nonfiction writers, poets, critics, and other book lovers, including the staff of the New York Times Book Review. And in today's paper, you can see the chunk of the list that is number 60 to number 41. For example, we have coming in at number 59, Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides. The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt is at number 46. Toni Morrison right behind, if you will, with A Mercy at number 47. The only criteria here is that the book has to be published in the United States. It can be published anywhere else as well, but it has to have touched American soil. It has to be in English. Translations are okay. And it has to be published sometime after January 1st, 2000.
And the list is really, really interesting to look at. And I just would say to listeners who are having a look at that, many of those authors, they can find interviews with them on Meet the Writers, which you'll find in our archive. Charles, I would perhaps posit that one of the best books after 2000 has not yet been published. It might be called Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia.
Well, the book will be published. Thank you very much, Georgina. The book is coming out in November, so just in time to squeeze onto this list if the New York Times is listening. Just reading through this list in itself is fascinating. You get to sort of reminisce about books that you've read. You get to look forward to digesting books that you haven't read. And it's a great sort of taking the temperature of sort of the cultural zeitgeist, who's on there and who isn't.
Extraordinary stuff. You know, one author who's always fascinated me is Patricia Highsmith. And one of the reasons she's fascinated me is that she used to travel between France and Britain with snails smuggled inside her bra. She was obsessed with snails. She really loved them, and she wanted to take them backwards and forwards. And I just love that idea. The thought of it makes me feel quite squeamish, I have to say. I wonder how the thought of a man smuggling snakes, and that's not a euphemism, in his trousers goes down with you, because that's a big news today too.
It doesn't go down very well with me at all, and we're going to keep this nice and clean for an early morning broadcast. But we're looking at the BBC right now, which tells us that a man caught smuggling 100 snakes in his trousers. And so, you know, are those snakes in your trouser, or are you just happy to be crossing customs? And so this is a story about an unnamed man who was stopped at the border between Hong Kong and Shenzhen in China. And upon inspection, which couldn't have been all of that detailed, this individual had 104 snakes in 6 canvas drawstring bags inside his trousers. And each of these bags was stuffed with living snakes. It boggles the mind. The only thing that is more remarkable than this story is that it's not the first time it's happened. And much in the way of Patricia Highsmith, as you mentioned, just a year ago, a woman was caught at the exact same border smuggling snakes in her bra. So there's really something about, you know, leaving Hong Kong, going into Shenzhen, and taking squiggly live animals with you.
I wonder why. I mean, there must be a huge market for them.
Well, so that's the thing. So the BBC tells us that China is one of the world's centers for, you know, rare animal black markets and for animal smuggling. We're aware that there's, of course, different sort of culinary and also medicinal uses for exotic animals across China, and the country is a center for this sort of smuggling. If you're going to try this, you may want to choose a border other than Hong Kong, and you may want to try to hide your snakes in a slightly more clever fashion.
Charles, well done for not going where we thought this might lead. Yep. Here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. US President Joe Biden faced fresh doubts yesterday about his re-election chances from the former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the film star George Clooney, who may influence other Democratic lawmakers and financial donors. The abandoned Biden campaign, which has opposed Biden's candidacy over his handling of Israel-Gaza war, has urged all Americans to call for Biden to step aside, although saying it also has no delusions about Trump and his culture of hate. Biden says he will stay in the race and defeat Trump. The Taiwan Defense Ministry said today it's closely watching Chinese military movements after a surge in warplanes joined drills with China's Shandong aircraft carrier in the Pacific. The Chinese military exercises coincide with the Nato summit in Washington, where a draft communiqué says China has become a decisive enabler of Russia's war effort in Ukraine, and Beijing continues to pose systemic challenges to Europe and to security. And Rwandan President Paul Kagame is expected to cruise to a fourth term in office in an election on Monday against 2 opposition candidates who were cleared to run against him but have only modest expectations. Kagame won nearly 99% of the vote in the last election in 2017, which followed a constitutional change removing term limits that would have barred him from standing again. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Amid all the talk of Ukraine and Joe Biden at the Nato summit in Washington this week, the military alliance also released an updated strategy on dealing with climate change. Monocle's Andrew Muller spoke with Sherry Goodman, a climate and defence specialist and vice chair of the US Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board. Andrew began by asking Sherry about some of her more recent comments that climate change isn't just a threat multiplier, but can sometimes actually provide an opportunity for peace.
You know, we still face a lot of threats in the world, and climate, I believe, is one of those threats. I characterize it as a threat multiplier. But there are also opportunities to advance peace and peace building by recognizing that aspects of our natural systems, water, food, and energy in particular, and climate as part of that, can be a source of developing cooperation in conflict zones. You know, we always first want to have the opportunity to avoid conflict and avoid war. And increasingly with climate change, you know, our natural systems, energy, food, and water are stressed, biodiversity, because of heat, extreme weather events, drought, and the like. But in places around the world, even in the conflict-ridden Middle East right now, you see local groups of Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanians through Eco-Peace Middle East, for example, who have devised plans for promoting water and energy cooperation across boundaries. And that will be an essential part of building the peace in that region. And we see that increasingly in conflict zones around the world, where addressing the stresses put on our natural systems, if you will, is part of building the peace and enduring peace.
But in terms of promoting policies like that, and it does all sound entirely sensible, do you not run up against the same problem that I think you run up against with promoting a lot of environmental policies, that these tend to be long-term measures, which democratic governments trying to survive to the end of next month are usually a little bit suspicious of?
Well, look, often, as we say, the inbox trumps the long-term planning. But increasingly, we see climate threats in the inbox because we have wildfires that are just phenomenal across much of North America and Europe now. We're already in another major heat wave this summer with temperatures rising, the Arctic opening. We can't afford to wait because we're paying now. We're paying for these disasters in lives lost, infrastructure damaged, populations moving, food and water insecurity. We're already paying now. So we have to build this into the way we plan our societies, plan our militaries. And as part of the energy transition that we are already well into now, we have to think about how we plan the energy transition in a way that also helps promote peace. For example, where we have critical mineral supply chains in regions of the world that have traditionally been exploited for their mining, how could create better jobs and opportunities across the full supply chain, not just the mining, but also the processing and the recycling. We often forget, in energy, we forget that recycling and efficiency is extremely important and is a huge part of the energy transition, often overlooked.
Where do you see a role for an organisation like Nato in this, though? Because this is, of course, primarily a military alliance, though you have noted before, counterintuitive though it may seem, that militaries are increasingly pathfinders and pioneers on things like climate and clean energy, because they kind of have to be if this is the world that they're going to attempt to operate in.
Well, just earlier today, I moderated a panel at the Canadian Embassy, kicked off by the Prime Minister Trudeau, and announcing the launch of the new NATO's newest Center of Excellence, the Canadian-based Center on Climate Change and Security. And NATO just today has released its third annual Climate and Security Impact Assessment. There will also be statements in the NATO communique on it, and NATO also is releasing a new document on energy by design, energy security by design. So, first of all, our militaries are a reflection of our societies. They are affected by climate change. We do see our forces, our military forces, active duty and guard in all NATO member countries and reserves being called up more frequently to respond to wildfires and floods and hurricanes and rescues of populations displaced and on the move. So already our military is being increasingly tasked with climate action. And then there's how climate affects the military operating forces, because today they have to be able to operate in an increasingly open Arctic, an Arctic that could be the next new maritime domain with shorter sea lanes from Asia to Europe and North America, even in the next few decades, and with increasing competition for the resources up there. And thirdly, military installations and communities are affected by sea level rise, and wildfires and drought. And finally, also have to become, as a major user of energy, it's incumbent on the military to do its part to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also to keep up with the rest of society in the energy transition. So as we electrify, as we decarbonize, how does that affect military operations? And oh, by the way, the forces that will be lighter, more agile, and can operate in today's contested logistics environment will have a competitive advantage in a future warfight. So we say in sort of defense speak that decarbonization also advances military effectiveness when done properly and mindful of what the mission is.
That's Sherry Goodman there, speaking to Monocle's Andrew Muller. You're with Monocle Radio. Samsung Electronics is the world's largest maker of memory chips, smartphones and televisions. A union representing workers at the flagship unit of the South Korean conglomerate Samsung Group, which is the biggest of the family-controlled businesses that dominate Asia's fourth largest economy, has called for an indefinite strike. The union represents around 30,000 members and was only set up in 2020. Well, Steve Borowick is a staff writer for Nikkei Asia in Seoul and joins me down the line now. Steve, firstly, why have Samsung workers only had a union since 2020?
The company has long had a kind of anti-union policy where they've both formally discouraged unions, and the workplace culture has just been one where if workers have a kind of grievance that they don't organize and they don't agitate openly, they kind of address it behind closed doors. The idea is that these South Korean conglomerates have a kind of militaristic culture where the idea is that everybody works together and sacrifices for the greater good. And I think behind the scenes in places like Samsung, authorities have seen union organizing as kind of contrary to the company's goals, and they've kind of wanted to project a public image of unity and of everybody being happy and coming together. That has changed somewhat in recent years. There's been, as we're seeing now, there's been moves towards organizations, and just this week there's been, what I think is the biggest and now longest ever strike by workers there. It's a pretty fresh and significant development, I think.
Well, so give us the background then to this industrial action, because it's the second to take place within Samsung.
So these workers are just, what they're asking for is pretty conventional when it comes to union activism. They're just asking for an increase in pay and for, I believe it's just one more holiday. Samsung workers are, like a lot of people in this country, are notorious for putting in really long hours, having really grueling and demanding work schedules. And the company, as you laid out in the intro, was one of the biggest producers of semiconductors and flat screens and all kinds of other high-selling items nowadays. So it seems to me like all the workers are really asking for is just a larger share of the company's profits. And they are withholding their labor in a way that has been, I think, it's unprecedented at the company.
So what proportion of Samsung workers does the union represent, and how many are actually taking part, and how will this affect output?
I think it's a relatively small portion. I think it's only something like 20% of the overall workforce. It's in the thousands. But the company and the union are kind of saying different things as to whether or not it has a disruptive potential. If these workers are from the semiconductor sector, for example, like the equipment that is needed to produce semiconductors is really expensive. It's really advanced, and it has to be kept on 24 hours a day. Like you can't just turn it off if there's not enough workers on the site. So Samsung has just so far, they have not said that this has caused any real discernible disruption, but it definitely has the potential to do that if it goes on any longer. And the people who are speaking on behalf of the union have sent a different message. They have pretty clearly said that they are willing to throw a wrench in Samsung's production process, and they are willing to cause the company to potentially have to miss production targets if it comes to that.
Steve, I'd just like to explore more why this indefinite strike is so significant for the company.
Well, it's a big departure from how things have customarily worked at Samsung, it might be hard for somebody who doesn't live in this country to understand like just how significant of a brand Samsung is here. It kind of hangs over everything. It's a huge part of the economy. And I know a few people who work there, and the company's internal culture is very much like you don't agitate for changes, you don't complain too much, because you're really lucky to be there. And if you don't like your job, there's literally thousands of people who would be happy to come in and replace you. So it's very rare that Samsung employees publicly, not even Samsung employees will sometimes leak things to the local press on condition of anonymity. But for a bunch of Samsung workers to come out and hold, publicly using their real names and with their faces uncovered, say that they are willing to disrupt the country's biggest conglomerate because they feel as though management is not coming to the table as they should. That's a big development. As you said in the intro, the current union there was only formed in 2020. So this, just in a few years, we've seen a real escalation. So it's a very novel thing.
And is the workplace attitude within Samsung indicative of how workers feel across South Korea?
Well, I think like everywhere in the world, we are moving towards a kind of more individualistic way of seeing the world. I think younger people are less likely to want to sacrifice in the name of some bigger collective. They're less likely to want to suppress what they see as their own personal interests in the name of some greater good. And I see that as what's happening in Samsung. Like I said, these conglomerates have long had this idea that like you work from very early in the morning until late at night. You come in on the weekend when they have to. A friend of mine who worked at Samsung just told me that because the company's profits was down recently, everybody above a certain pay grade was going to be asked to indefinitely come into the office on Saturdays. And that's not because there's something in particular that they have to do on Saturdays, but it's just because everybody needs to work that much harder. And that has always been the kind of prevailing ethos at these big companies, that you can never work too hard, you can never sacrifice too much, because this whole thing is much bigger than you are. So the very significant change that I identify is that we have a relatively small group of the company saying that they are going to withhold their work because they want to spur some kind of internal change.
And what do you think the effect of this strike will be within the country? Might we see other businesses take similar action?
I wouldn't even call it an open secret. I say it's just like an open principle in this economy that all the other companies look to Samsung and kind of mimic what Samsung is doing. And that can be in terms of how they manage their workplaces internally. That could be their business strategy. That could be their branding. So I have no doubt that every other company in this country is watching this closely and taking cues from it. If this industrial action ends up being successful, I think it could very well inspire workers at other companies to follow suit. If it ends in some kind of failure, if it damages Samsung's stock price, if it damages their production capacity, then I could see other companies using this as a warning and strongly discouraging workers and perhaps instituting some kind of penalties to prevent it. But what happens at Samsung will certainly not stay at Samsung.
And just finally, Steve, does this damage South Korea's global attractiveness as a leading Asian business hub?
Well, industrial action at Samsung is uncommon, but in the country as a whole, it's normal. It happens all the time. At Hyundai and at any kind of smaller company, it's quite common to see at times quite intense union activism and strikes and all kinds of collective action. So anybody who's considering investing in this country, I'm sure is already aware of that. It is unique that, like as we've laid out, it's unique that this is now coming to Samsung. Time will tell if this results in being a kind of sea change or if this is just the latest industrial disturbance that raises some flags among investors, but after that, it might just be business as usual.
Steve, thank you very much indeed. That's Steve Borowick in Seoul, and this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries. over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
It's time now to talk business with Rachel Papazzoni, who's a national business reporter and presenter at ABC News. She joins us down the line from Perth. Rachel, we were just talking about this big strike at Samsung in South Korea and how that might indeed affect tech stocks. And we're looking here at a story about how Wall Street keeps hitting high records driven by tech stocks, and that could be helping to lift Asian markets too. Tell us more.
Oh, it certainly is, Georgina. Japan's Nikkei had another record day today. It surpassed the 42,000-point mark on its index, reaching as high as 42,330 points in its mid-afternoon trade. So that was up 1.2%. It has closed just shy of that, just under 1% higher. But as you said, this is all linked to this stellar run we're seeing in technology stocks, particularly the likes of Nvidia in the US, and that's really carrying that wave across the globe. And so we saw quite widespread gains across Japan's Nikkei today. Some of the top tech stocks in Japan were its chip-making equipment giant Tokyo was up 1.2%, Disco Corp up 3%, Sony Group up 3.7%, Sumco up 5.1%. So we're really seeing this continued interest in tech, particularly AI. Obviously, what's happening in South Korea is probably going to have an impact on some of those stocks as well, which may see demand for them fall if nothing's being made at Samsung headquarters for some time as workers continue to strike in South Korea.
Right. We're also seeing Japan equities climbing to all-time highs over the past 2 weeks. Analysts are saying that that's due to further yen depreciation and more clarity on the outcome of the US presidential election.
That's right. It really shows you, doesn't it, how interconnected we all are. Down here in Australia and Japan, not far further north from us, all the way over to the US and to yourself in the UK. There's so much interconnection between how all our economies work and how politics also flies into that. Of course, we've got the US federal election in November, the presidential election in November, and there's a day doesn't go by where activity in that doesn't move markets. So we're seeing these huge changes. The yen, Japan's currency, has also been reaching lows. In fact, in Australia, we've been covering quite a lot of stories about how the number of Australians who are travelling to Japan on that exchange rate, it's just so good for domestic travellers here to head over there. So there's all sorts of impacts in the global economy. It's not just equity markets, it's not just politics, it's not just currency. They all connect.
Right, of course. Let's look to the US now, because inflation there, as measured by the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is forecast to rise. What's the detail on that?
Yes, so we'll get that information out of the US later today, local time. So this will be for the June quarter. Now, at an annual rate, it's expected to have shown an increase of 3.1%, which will be lower than the May annual data that came out at 3.3%. The core inflation, which is really what central bankers really look at, because that strips out some of those more volatile prices like food and fuel, is tipped to be 3.4% on an annualized basis and up 2% for the month. So that's still not really very close at all to the 2% that the US Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell wants to see inflation at in the US. And so the expectation is that this number won't really do much to move any forecasts in terms of what the US Fed does next. We did hear from Jerome Powell this week when he testified before US Congress, and he said, or confirmed, I guess, that it wouldn't be appropriate to cut the policy rate there until there was greater confidence that inflation was sustainably heading towards that 2% range. So if the numbers come out later today as predicted, that confirms that it's still got some way to go to 2%. So the likelihood of a cut remains unlikely. Maybe later in the year, but markets will closely be watching what the numbers reveal today and look at the detail in those numbers as well.
Absolutely, Rachel. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. And finally, on today's show, the artificial intelligence revolution continues to cause waves in the art world. Whilst concerns persist about generative AI producing increasingly sophisticated forgeries, new software has been developed that uses neural networks to detect fakes. Its developers believe the revolution has already begun. Journalist George Ruskin has been finding out more.
In the battle against AI forgery, a new weapon is emerging. It is an AI program that promises clients accurate authentication from nothing more than a single photo of the work. The software, called art recognition, has already authenticated the works of old masters and priceless Van Gogh treasures. However, it is yet to trigger a revolution on the scale of ChatGPT, and the art industry has been slow in its adoption of this technology. Worse still, there are concerns that such technology actually poses an existential risk to the industry through increasingly sophisticated generative AI capabilities. This is about more than one software program. It is about a technological breakthrough that has the potential to revolutionize the practice of authentication that is still stubbornly analog and eye-wateringly expensive for collectors, galleries and art dealers. I spoke to Art Recognition's developer, Dr. Karina Popovic, and asked her to explain the neural network that powers it, as she would to a slightly sceptical potential client.
The AI learns as the experts do. So what we're doing, we're feeding in photographs of authentic images by an artist, so verified and matched against the catalog raisonnés, but also negative examples, photographs of paintings created by the workshop or followers or the school, also modern imitations and even digital imitations created by a generative AI. But the principle is very similar to what an art expert would do.
Unsurprisingly, Karina was quick to talk me through the advantages of AI art authentication.
The AI does it much faster, of course, so we have learned several hundreds of artists, whereas an expert would spend his whole career essentially on learning one or two artists.
Many people remain unconvinced, however. The art industry remains remarkably old school, and the process of authenticating paintings looks pretty much exactly the same as it did before the information age. Collectors still have to send their pieces to a leading expert, someone who passes an esoteric judgment based on a lifetime of specialization in one artist. The client is lumbered with the costs of shipping a potentially priceless work of art across the world and the insurance that requires. Karina developed art recognition to revolutionize this practice, removing much of the time and money that is wasted in the traditional process. Changing people's minds has taken a long time. Gaining the trust of dealers and collectors has been a long process. It has come from the company's transparency about how their AI works. I asked Karina for a look under the hood of this software to see what it is programmed to identify when it is authenticating an artwork.
It learns in what we call layers. So it starts by looking at edges, for example, or brush lines. So the tiny elements, maybe the eyes or the nose in a figure. Then on the next layer, it will learn the full figure. So not just the eyes and the nose, but the whole head, for example. We split the images into smaller portions in order to give the chance to the network to see the fine details. So for Van Gogh, for example, that very often used very small brush lines that would be learned from the smaller tiles, whereas some artists used like larger, movements. So they have larger brush strokes. And in that case, we would create the bigger tiles, or the net would learn from the bigger batches.
As a result, trust is increasing. And art recognition, currently still the only commercially available program is finally gaining recognition as a game changer. They have to date certified more than 500 authenticities for clients in more than 20 countries. But who are the most in-demand artists for evaluation? This can tell us who the software has become most expert in. As a rule of thumb with AI, you get out what you put in.
There are a few exceptions, but almost always the most expensive artists are also very prolific, so Van Gogh, Cézanne, Renoir, Monet, there are thousands of images that they have created, so thousands of artworks. And that's the kind of artists that we are being asked to analyze. And the artists that are less valuable, they usually didn't create too much. So there is a correlation. So in general, the artists that we get to train on and to run analysis on clients' paintings, the data sets are very good. Probability scores are also very high.
Guessing out what you put in is a good thing when it is harnessed by experts like Karina and her team. But the rise of generative AI is a way in which this technology threatens to undo all the progress art recognition has made in the fight against forgeries. Essentially a super forger, generative AI can produce increasingly sophisticated imitations of great artists' works in the amount of time it takes to load a web page. The danger here is that the more detail the artificial intelligence can learn from software like art recognition, the more convincing the forgeries that generative AI can produce. Forgery software could then potentially fail to detect these works because they were generated using the same data that it is programmed to detect. This is part of wider concerns about multimodal artificial intelligence, in which software that is currently kept separate from other programs combines to form an out-of-control artificial superintelligence.
There is a less good development, the fact that Gen AI can be used, for example, to create fakes. And something that just until a couple of years ago was a fantasy scenario is unfortunately becoming reality. The fact that skilled forgers can use these tools to create art pieces in the style of a famous artist, and then someone would put it on canvas and would try to sell it on the internet. So this is a very dangerous development, and we are trying to stay ahead of the curve, actually. So that's the reason why we started feeding into our software digital forgeries. So in order to help, in order to expose our AI to deep fakes and learn to distinguish them from real art.
There is no doubt that artificial intelligence will play a central role in authenticating art, even if many in the industry refuse to recognize it yet. Getting a glimpse into how this artificial intelligence works has left me with more trust that these algorithms know what they are looking at and what they are not. For Monocle Radio, I'm George Ruskin.
Many thanks to George, who was in conversation with the developer of art recognition, Dr. Karina Popovic. And that's all for today's programme. Many thanks to our producers, Angelica Jobson, Carlotta Rebello and Paige Reynolds, our researcher, Sana Jumanji, and our studio manager, Steph Chungu. After the headlines, there's more music on the way, and I'll be back with the briefing that's live at midday in London. We'll be hearing from Andrew Muller, who's at the Nato summit in Washington. We'll also be looking at France's former First Lady, Carla Bruni Sarkozy. She's been charged over an election funding scandal that dates back to 2007. It involves cash from the then Libyan dictator, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. So all of that coming up at midday London time. And the Globalist, of course, will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.